All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Orange Crush podcast presented by Newton Scott and Associates. For more on them, be sure to stay tuned. And this video is also presented by Chick-fil-A. We want to thank Herb Tyler for his support on the podcast. But today, it's a little bit of a solo outing from myself, David Hood, trusted co-host, and really just the fan favorite around here, is on vacation. So we're going to take the duties for this week's episode and sort of bounce all over the place. Felt like it was important to touch on Clemson's portal successes and a recent report that TP Wentworth potentially is entering the portal. Just sort of this continuous flow. You get to see all the ins and outs, and we've been reporting that heavily on TigerNet.com. And we'll also get into some insights on Dabo Swinney's camp, particularly sort of outside the recruiting lenses, because we've been writing about it extensively, of course, but I think what the opportunity those camp sessions provide are a little bit more than just tracking the 4 stars and the 5 stars that come on campus and evaluating where they stand with Clemson. It's more about what we see beyond it. We have to dig into it. We have to read between the lines, per se. And so I think that it's really fascinating. We just wanted to provide a couple of points there for you guys to take in. But starting with the transfer portal, the recent news is TP Wentworth, freshman left-handed pitcher and outfielder, has entered the transfer portal. Sort of an interesting development given the last few days. Clemson's been sort of on a fire sale in the transfer portal. And I think an interesting conversation has been brought up online about how we define the transfer portal and the successes. And we've kind of seen it in 2 sports, where in basketball and baseball, we've seen Brownell and Bakich really identify needs in that current offseason and go out and get it. In Brownell's case, it was Victor Locken, Jaden Zachary, and you had a couple of bench players like Miles Foster, for example. You bring in some extra pieces to try to see how it all works out. Jake Heidbreeder was technically a part of that transfer class, as well as Christian Reeves, and some worked out and some didn't. And how we judge how successful they were is sort of just the results. And it sort of reminds me of the draft in a way, where we may praise the Falcons or we may praise the Steelers, for example, for really going out and being patient and getting a key need. So the Falcons, for example, get 2 edge rushers, the Georgia and Tennessee prospects. Now, currently, it's Friday, June 13th. Those are viewed as solid moves for Atlanta because they went out and they identified, okay, what's our crippling need right now? And obviously that was pass rusher for them, as they've got their franchise quarterback. They've got a solid offense around him, but they weren't able to get to the quarterback all year. And so you go out and get 2 of them, and you're able to sort of steal one in the process, and adding James Pierce, the Tennessee guy. And so, not to turn this into an NFL thing, but just to sort of prove the point of how maybe 6 months down the road, both aren't very good. And are those evaluations at that time still perceived as, well, they went out and got the need, it just didn't work out? How do we evaluate that? And so for Clemson baseball and basketball, you sort of go from in the offseason, go, man, Brownell and Bakich doing fantastic jobs of identifying the needs, going out and getting what was necessary. And then you segue months later, and we see with baseball that obviously guys like Luke Gaffney, Colin Priest, underwhelmed in their first years at Clemson. The jury is clearly still out on them because they're going to come back, and we're going to see how that all works out. But you also look at someone like Dominic Listy, someone who really made an impact and was a consistent presence alongside Cam Canarella. And so you look at this new portal cycle for Clemson, and so you've added the Ryan Weidmans of the world. That's pending the MLB draft and where he sort of slotted and how much leverage that'll plays out with NIL and contracts, and we'll see how that front plays out. But guys like Ty Daly or Nate Siovi or Bryce Claymont out of Georgia, how are we going to evaluate this at the time? And I think it's interesting to note that Erik Bakich said right after the Kentucky game, and it's been about 2 weeks since that result is finalized. And so you look at sort of the words that he added is that this current roster potentially overachieved in the win column. They were a 45-win team. Maybe the stats didn't necessarily reflect that at the time. And you look at sort of the acquisitions they made. Gaffney, one of the, I think it was the Big Ten freshman of the year out of Purdue, and he isn't part of your starting 9 in the postseason. Colin Priest, one of the touted power hitters, doesn't necessarily get it done. Jacob Jarrell is that guy that Clemson fans look to for that consistent power that Clemson so often lacked during the season, and it ended up biting them in the postseason. And so you look at sort of what they evaluated, how they went through that process. I think at the time it was a consensus view that Gaffney was the right choice for Clemson, just sort of looking at him specifically. And now, months later, is that on the media, in a sense? Is it me talking through the microphone? Are we to say that these players coming up that Bakich and Clemson have acquired in the portal at the time, and as of recording this, we all probably can sit down and agree and say, yes, these are the right moves. If you can keep Weidman from going into the MLB, you got the center fielder to replace Cam Canarella. You got the shortstop in Lichtenberg to replace Andrew Chufo. And so you've plugged and played, and you've sort of accomplished part of your goals. Now, still, I think a quality arm or two, just as my personal opinion would be, I think the icing on the cake that they've already made and really developed this transfer class, just because Clemson, you never know, injuries have happened. Dane Moeller, someone they expected to be a potential Sunday starter for them, is out for the entire season. You have to sort of go from there and rotate things around. So it all depends on so many different circumstances. And so for this group, I'd say at the time, and it's difficult because it sort of allows us to change our opinions and say in June, yeah, Bakich has done a great job this offseason. But maybe in May, we're sitting again in May of 2026, and it hasn't worked out. And this team hasn't reached Omaha or whatever goal we decide is fair for that group. And so I think that portal conversation is oh so fascinating. And so when you look at the case of TP Wentworth, who's taken off, maybe a result of the added talent they brought in. Maybe he doesn't see himself as a piece or a part of the starting nine. Someone that jumped onto the scene at Pittsburgh, obviously was a talented freshman that was sort of in and out of the lineup, but had consistently found that spot in the order after that. I think it was during that Pittsburgh series where it really started happening. Gaffney was hurt, and it was just something that he never looked back on. And so now we sort of view it as, okay, you had a freshman usurp one of your top portal guys. How do we view that? Is that a poor evaluation on Clemson's part? Is that the media's fault for potentially overvaluing the acquisition? So I think it's just something to note about moving forward on just the portal in general. Because obviously, and I put it out on Twitter last night, Erik Bakich has done a phenomenal job in the portal so far. They've identified what they've needed on the offensive side, and they've gone out and gotten it. And obviously, there's still some circumstances that we're waiting on, July's MLB draft being one of them. But as of right now, Clemson's still proven that they're a home staying power. A lot of the conversations that I've had with some of the transfer portal players have been they want to come here because of the culture that Erik Bakich has established, and they want to be that missing piece. Talking to Ty Daly out of Mercer, felt like he was that missing power hitter that Clemson needs. And he and Bakich envision himself as sort of a middle-of-the-lineup guy that can juice things up if needed. And so we'll see how all that moves going forward. But I think for Clemson, as of right now, probably you're looking at it, you're waiting for the season obviously start, the deck will stack wherever it may fall. But you got to be proud and pleased of Clemson's evaluation. It'll just come time to see how it all pans out on the diamond. Before we get back to this video, we'd like to thank the title sponsor for this podcast, Newton, Scott, and Associates. This team is headlined by Jeff Scott, former Clemson assistant coach and two-time national champion, as well as Eric Newton, a longtime local and trusted real estate partner. These two are teaming up to provide a first-class experience for all Clemson fans. Whether you're looking to buy, sell, or build in the upstate area of South Carolina, you can trust Newton, Scott, and Associates. Choose the same team that Clemson coaches are selecting when they're looking to buy, sell, or build, all the way from Tigertown to Lake Kiowee. For more information, you can find them at newtonscottsc.com or by calling the number 864-722-9062. That's 864-722-9062. Now, let's get back to the video. Obviously, moving forward, and something we've been covering extensively on TigerNet has been Dabo Swinney's football camp. And it's one of the final pieces of, I think, if we were to map out sort of the calendar, is you start with football, basketball sort of crosses into the hemisphere, And then it becomes this madness of crossover season where you have basketball, baseball, softball. So much is happening. Spring practice, spring game. And then things start to truly slow down. Baseball takes center stage. And then it becomes all about where things are headed as we move towards football season once again. But we get this week in between to sort of peer through that window of what things could potentially look like. And I think what was so fascinating, beyond the Peyton Houstons of the world, beyond the Carter Jones who receive offers from Clemson and sort of build this 2027 class, is there's so much, I think, to it. And there's so much more than the surface probably offers. And so when looking at this camp and the week that we get, one of the things that stuck out to me and something that we wrote on TigerNet this morning as of recording this is Ben Boulware. And one of the most striking things to me is it's the middle of June. It's really, really hot out there. And anyone that's been out there covering this, or maybe you have a child that was at one of these camps, it's blazing. And on some of those turf fields, particularly on the offensive line side of the field where they go work out in that corner, it is uncomfortably hot. And this is someone who's just walking around with a notepad, taking it in. I can't imagine what it would be like. And I do kind of remember I was at one of Dabo Sweeney's camps when I was a freshman in high school. I remember how hot it was. I was only there for briefly a day because I broke my arm, but that's a story for another time. But there's sort of a required focus sometimes. And this was the start of the Friday session. So this was the weekend campers. These are the people that are going to be here for the next couple days. And they're trying to figure out themselves, okay, how do I approach this? Am I someone that if I play well, there's potentially an offer coming? But at the very beginning, it's about 2:30. It's blazing hot. You're sort of trying to figure out where you are. Maybe you don't know anybody. Focus could be eluding. And what was so captivating about watching Boulware was all those ingredients come together. And what he's saying isn't technically necessarily different from the rest of the crowd, but every camper perks up. And if you're watching on YouTube, you sort of see it's like when you hear the food for a dog. It's dinner time, and the ears perk up, and they run over to the pantry, and they're ready to go. And it's the same thing they've heard or regurgitated for quite some time. But when that sound transpires, echoes, they're there to listen. And that was sort of what it was like with Boulware. Was the second he started to open his mouth to convey his message, and his opening thing before they started stretching was not really the same from what Coach Batson was relaying. And I think it's fascinating to see, and talking to some of these recruits and prospects at this camp, was when Boulware speaks, we listen. And part of the word that I got in the theme was relatability. And the idea that Boulware's message echoes so much. He's one of the greatest linebackers in Clemson history. He's a part of that team that took Clemson to the mountaintop. And I think part of what makes him so famous was that unapologetic passion, that grabbing the mic in Tampa and saying, this is for Taj, this is for Sammy, this is for everyone that came before us, that still sort of carries with him today, even so much to go and work as an unpaid volunteer. And now his moment has finally come to be a true contributor. Not saying he wasn't last year, but the name, the title, everything's more official. And we started to see that with his push with Tyler Atkinson, a 5-star out of Grayson. We've seen that push with other players. I talked to Max Brown, who obviously was committing to Clemson for a variety of reasons, but one of the things he kept relaying to me was the idea that Ben Boulware is going to be my head coach. And I grew up watching him reach that pinnacle as a linebacker at my position. And the things that he's telling me, they're evident. They're relevant. They're things that I've heard before. Yeah, maybe some other coaches can relay this, and you're sort of just letting it go in one ear and out the other. But there's something so powerful and so potent to what he's saying because he's lived that. And I think it's so important to add that in an era where everything feels very transactional, very NIL driven, there's still a component of sentimental value. There's still a component of relationships. And I think that's something that Boulware perhaps understands. And I think that's got to be to Dabo Sweeney's credit for once when Tom Allin got hired, you make that move to promote Boulware. and move Allin as more of this CEO type that can float from position to position. We still saw it at camp was whenever he was required his presence, maybe it had to be with the defensive lineman. Maybe it was with the safeties. He sort of just walked around and floated and didn't necessarily have to worry about what was going on with the linebackers because you have that sort of sense of trust and control that they were able to bring to the forefront. So it's just something to consider with how things are going to move forward. Obviously, we don't have results on the field that necessarily determine how things are going to move going forward, but I still think it's important to note of the impact that he's already starting to have, and we haven't even kicked off with LSU yet, and so that's kind of fascinating. And one of the final notes, and we can talk about some recruits too. I sort of want to save some of that stuff for when David returns because we both have really interesting notes and stories to share. But one of the other things that was really fascinating about the week was the presence of Ian Shefflin. And now, of course, we've probably beaten that like a dead horse. We've gone crazy over that acquisition and sort of the switch and what it means for Clemson, what it potentially means for Shefflin and his pro basketball career. Is that being put on hold? Is that terminated? We don't necessarily have all the answers. Only really, truly Shefflin does. But I think what sticks out to me is when you're trying to do something new, you're trying to do something that's unfamiliar, maybe perhaps uncomfortable, because I think a lot of the times you're standing out there in the heat, and Shefflin really wasn't doing much. And when you compare him to some of the other player coaches, maybe it's Adam Randall, maybe it's Cade Klubnik, who's super hands-on with some of the top quarterbacks when they're available. And I don't think this is something maybe that they're required to do. I'm not speaking on any pre-dated knowledge. I don't know if it's you have to be able to fill in certain hours. But a lot of the players are out there. Tristan Smith was another one who just had a smile on his face, grinning from ear to ear, clearly absolutely loves just being around there. And he wasn't coaching the top A group by any means, but the insight he was giving just to be able to work and be on that field, I think that still echoes the message he sent to us after the spring game was he just loves Clemson. And so every moment he's here, he's going to soak that up. But moving quickly back to Shefflin before we wrap things up today is I think it might speak a louder message than just him trying to practice his break off in the side. Maybe there's a break. The campers are getting water and he's practicing his release with Kyle Richardson. Or Sweeney drives over in the golf cart to give him some parting words. I think, level of attention and him being at every single session that we covered. He was there from start to finish and was engaged. He was throwing passes to campers. He was offering advice when he could. He's still an incredible athlete, so there's still part of that, I think, muscle memory from just purely being at one of the highest levels in college basketball. Shefflin being an all-ACC forward, there's still some things that he maybe can teach you just from a different perspective. And so looking at it in that way, there's something so fascinating to just watching him, even if it doesn't really pertain to the overall recruiting scene. There's still a level of care that has stuck with it. And really, I think shows the level of seriousness that both he and Clemson are committed to trying to see this thing through. And whether it results in a one catch, one touchdown against Furman, for example, where he's probably not going to crack the rotation if we're being completely honest with ourselves. But maybe there's something gimmicky in there. Maybe there's a fun story where he gets to try that out, show a little bit of film, and maybe something crazy happens. I don't know. We haven't reached July yet. We haven't really gotten to see how this works. But I think the story is going to continue to be fascinating. Part of that commitment is coming out to these camps and doing some of the grunt work before you get to the football and put on the pads. But we'll see. Things are continuing to evolve as well over at TigerNet.com for a bunch of more stuff. So, guys, thank you as always for tuning in. Thanks for listening to this solo outing on this podcast. We want to thank Newton Scott and Associates for their sponsorship. Guys, thank you for tuning in. Subscribe for more. God bless y'all. Have a good one.